My Thane, the western outposts report horrible news. Thane Bolgrim Whitehammer looked across his throne room at the approaching messenger and waved him forward to deliver his missive. The dead have risen from the lowlands and are making their way to the pass of Velric Nos. This news set the couriers mumbling, and the fear in the room became palpable. Thane Bolgrim knew that he had to take decisive action, or the resulting politics could prove a more trying danger than the walking dead. The Thane called to his warsmith, Feldspar. Warsmith, make ready your weapons to travel. We shall lead troops to reinforce the western outposts. The dead shall not gain access to the pass. At the word of the Thane, soldiers and courtiers moved quickly to muster the guard of Gyll Karran for war. In the long centuries since Gyll Karran's founding, nothing had proven a true danger to the dwarven city, and the Thane was certain that a few measly corpses would not change that. Hi everyone, Matiram here with another narrative battle report. Tonight has the Dwarves of Gyll Karran facing off against the Empire of Dust, which is a new entry and a late entry to our narrative. Tonight, this is a 2,000 point game with the Invade scenario. So, a whole army versus shambling versus dwarves playing Invade. This should be interesting. This is the first time we've played Invade, and this is my Empire of Dust players' second game of Kings of War, and grand total of, I think, fourth game of Wargaming altogether. So should be interesting, and this is my first game with dwarves across the board, playing with dwarves, I mean. So we're both kind of starting from a point of newness here. But let's go ahead and get into deployment. So, starting with the Empire of Dust, this is actually basically the same list he took in the last Empire of Dust game with some very small tweaks. First thing, starting on the left there, we have a regiment of skeleton cavalry. Then behind the forest, we have a single cursed high priest. Next to that is a regiment of skeleton archers. In front of them is a regiment of skeletal spearmen. Then there is a regiment of revenant chariots. Behind them is a regiment of enslaved guardians. Then he has a bone giant. Oh, and I missed, right in front of the high priest is his scorpion husk. I guess I didn't see that in the first picture. In front of the bone giant, he has a regiment of swarm. On the other side of that little blocking piece of terrain, he has another regiment of archers, skeleton archers. Then he has a horde of revenants. These guys have exchanged their shields for two-handed weapons. Then there is a second regiment of chariots, a regiment of revenant worm riders, and in the back is a troop of mummies with the pipes of terror. I missed his... Oh, I see. Behind the bone giant was his Ammonite Pharaoh with the Grimoire of Unspeakable Darkness. So, looking at my opponent's deployment, he's made some very strange choices, and I think ultimately some big mistakes here. He put all his archers behind, not really paying attention to where he needed his lines of sight. And he was, for some reason, really afraid of going into forests, so he kind of bunched everything up behind all this other terrain. I don't know at this point if he has some amazing strategy that he's planning for me, or if he's just afraid of my Dwarven War Machines, or if this is just inexperience showing. So I guess we will see here in a moment, but let's get on to the Dwarven deployment. Okay, so starting on the left, I have a regiment of shield breakers. Then I have two Iron Belcher organ guns, and right behind them is my warsmith, Feldspar. Next to that, right in front of the forest, is a regiment of Iron Watch rifles, and they have the brew of keen-eyedness. Next to that is a regiment of Iron Guard with the Dwarven Throwing Mastiff. Behind them is my army standard bearer with the banner of the Griffin. Then we have a unit of Ironclad, a regiment. Behind them is a regiment of Iron Guard who have exchanged their shields for two-handed weapons, and they also are equipped with a Dwarven Throwing Mastiff. Next is a regiment, two regiment of Berserkers next to each other there. Behind the first regiment of Berserkers is my Dwarven King with the Loot of Insatiable Darkness. Behind the second unit of Berserkers is a allied Forces of Nature Elementals unit that became Air Elementals. It's basically the stats of what I'm using for the old gyrocopter and bomber models. I figured there's nothing really in Kings of War that uses those for the dwarves, so I figured make them Air Elementals, so that should be fun. Up on the hill next to the right Berserker unit is a is a battle driller. And then on the other side of the hill here is an Iron Belcher cannon. So what I'm thinking, just kind of how things went out, this is my weak flank, and this is where my opponent piled most of his big scary stuff. So my hope here is that just the stuff here will tangle him up long enough for my stronger flank to go in and just blow everything off the board and essentially sneak half to three-quarters of my army across to his side and win by scenario. But we'll go ahead and see how that works out. So I actually won the roll to go first here, but I chose to defer, mainly because my opponent really wasn't in range of any of my good shooting, and he really wasn't going to do a whole lot since he can't march with anything, or at the advance with anything. So I figured, what would it hurt to go ahead and let him have the first go. As you can see here, he starts advancing his cavalry and his spearmen. Of these two, I'm definitely thinking the cavalry is the bigger threat, and I want them gone before they get into me. And over here, he does a pretty casual advance. This is the point where I think he starts realizing how much trouble he's in terms of his deployment, as he kind of looks and realizes he doesn't have any lines of sight with his archers. So he's just going to have to kind of deal with that and see where things go from here. Over here, the the Revenant Worm Riders didn't knock the fence down. It just will sit like right in the middle of them. But his Revenants move up to the one side of the fence, the Snakes move up to the other, and the Mummies are supporting the Snakes. Another move, and I will definitely mark this down to lack of familiarity with the rules and how the movement goes. He's moved his chariots, frankly, too far up, so they're kind of boxed in, and he's going to have some trouble diverting them around that building. So he's sort of unintentionally kept them out of the fight. So he didn't do any magic, didn't have any shooting he had line of sight on, so it's my turn. I decide to send my air elementals over the hill to go and support if he crosses that line. I figure my cannon should be good at putting some hurt on the Worm Riders before he gets to me. And if I'm lucky, that'll do enough wounds so that the air elementals can clean them up. I can't march with those guys, but they're fly 10, so they've got one hell of a charge range. And I'm almost at the point where I could charge them where they're standing after this move. I decide to go ahead and move up the Berserker units supported by the Battle Driller over there, because I figure he's going to come in at me with that horde, and if I can get like a triple charge on that horde with its frontage, these guys can probably put a decent amount of hurt on them, particularly if the king can play the lute and give them crushing strength. That should help me put some holes there. Over here, I move this brick up together. This is basically my big hammer. I've got two units up front with the shields. The Iron Guard have the 6-up defense. The Ironclad have 5 up, and then I've got my great weapon wielders behind them to kind of provide some support. So my idea here is just push this brick up as much as I can and try and cross that mid line. Now over here, I decide to put myself forward with the shield breakers with the idea that if I can't shoot his cavalry off, I'm going to make myself a tempting target for him to charge, but he will be disrupted in the water there, or not disrupted, hindered in the water there, and probably not going to take me out in one attack, and these guys should be able to do a decent amount of damage on the counter charge, so I'm kind of hoping that way. I figure by moving them up forward, I make them an easier target up front than my war machines to give them as much chance to shoot as is possible. And during shooting, it turns out I needn't have worried. I open up with both of my organ guns, and they blow the living hell out of these cavalrymen. It wasn't even close. Like after 2 sets of shooting, I was like, all right, I'm going to need double ones now, so I better shoot something else. The only downside about this is now that these shield breakers are here, they really don't have any purpose, and they're stuck in the water, so it's going to take a while to bring them around to do anything. Then over here, I shoot with my Iron Watch rifles and do pretty well. As you can see, I put 8 wounds on them, but I don't actually end up breaking or routing these guys, so they're still there. But just a regiment of spears with a bunch of wounds on them, I'm not overly worried. So we go into top of 2. This is when my opponent kind of realizes how stuck he is behind this terrain and starts wheeling around. And over here he pushes forward. I think he's throwing his swarms up to kind of bait charges, but I'm not frankly dumb enough to go for that because those swarms aren't worth anything. If he wants those swarms in combat, he's going to have to bring them to me. Other than that, he's pushing his spearmen up and his chariots just to kind of support. Again, you can kind of see how afraid he is to go in the forest, which I guess he's worried, particularly with the chariots, about losing Thunderous Charge, but it really forces him to kind of break his forces up, which I think benefits me. He does some shooting. Yeah, he barely has a line of sight from the archers on the right, just off the screen, to these berserkers. And I mean, we literally like busted out the laser sight to see if he could get them, and he could just barely see them. But he ends up actually doing a lot. The berserkers being the softest unit in my army defense-wise, he manages to sneak through 9 wounds. But they still have a nerve of 22, so they're not going anywhere. Then he does some shooting on this side. Gets through... Oh, because the chariots have some shooting. So yeah, so he shoots at the war machine with his archers in the back, puts 2 wounds on it, shoots at the rifleman with the chariots and gets 1 wound. So little smattering of wounds, not anything I'm concerned of at this point, particularly with the banner of the griffin and the inspiring from the banner bearer right within range. So I'm not all that worried, but it can slowly add up if he plays it right. So I go turn 2, sorry. My shield breakers are slowly starting the slog out of the water. I decide to press up with my main brick here. Not enough where he's going to get into me yet, but I definitely want to kind of slowly advance there. I don't want to leave anybody behind, really. And I edge up just a little bit with the ironclad there to try and protect the berserkers flank, because I moved them up a lot and I didn't actually have the movement to keep my guys together and do that perfectly. So if my opponent sees that, I could be in a little bit of trouble. Over here, again, I'm not really moving anything. I want his snakes to come to me. Ideally, if he kind of gets uppity and declares charges and gets himself out of his kind of block up here, I am thinking I might be able to pick off the snakes without sort of dealing with what he's got for backup. I go ahead and move up the berserkers and the battle driller so that he's essentially, unless he wants to give up a nasty flank to the berserkers, he's going to have to go into them first with that unit of revenants, and I will be perfectly happy to do that. I'm thinking he probably won't break them turn one, and then I'll be able to do a nice counter attack. So that's kind of where I'm going there. So my cannon actually gets off a shot, puts 4 wounds on the Worm Riders. The rest of my shooting decides to just blow those spearmen to absolute kingdom come. As you can see, by the time I was done with him, he was sitting on 14 wounds, and I routed him with no problem. One of the difficulties that he's doing here, again, maybe it just he doesn't know the rules as far as Inspire. He's leaving his characters very far back, so he's not really within inspiring range with anything, so I'm not having to reroll. So I get a good roll first time, and boom, they go bye-bye. So we go to turn 3 of Empire of Dust. He pushes up to basically just bring a lot of pressure here on this side. In the center, he pushes the chariots forward, starts bringing around his enslaved guardians, and throws his high priest and the scorpion husk into the forest. You can also see down center, he's brought his bone giant forward to threaten the berserkers, and did decide to go ahead and throw the swarm at the injured unit of berserkers, which I'm okay with. Given that they're hindered, I'm not thinking these guys are going to do a lot in the way of damage, and I'm okay with that. If he doesn't do much, he's not likely to break them, and then the counterattack, they should be able to sweep those swarm off. You can also see I did some shooting. I think I shot with one of the war machines on the chariots last turn, and did put 4 on them, so they're coming in injured as well. Then he does some surge, which I didn't think about, and he ends up clipping the berserkers, which once we put him in touch and slide them down, really does put a hurting on him, but it's not going to stop me if he doesn't kill them from getting my battle driller in next turn. But I am kind of concerned, because if he does get those guys open, then he's basically snuck a really kind of scary unit into my flank. Does some shooting and puts a single wound on my Iron Guard. And then we go into combat, and he puts 10 wounds onto the berserkers, but still, even with 10 wounds, he needs to roll a 12 twice to rout that unit, because I've got my king just off screen to the south, and he doesn't do it, so he bounces off, and I am going to make him regret his boldness. Same thing, he does, looks like 1 wound, I'm guessing, on these beholders with the swarm, and those guys aren't doing shit. So we go to my turn. Over here, I decide to push up. I finally get out of the water with the shield breakers, and I figure I'm just going to absolutely wreck face on that flank. They are within 1 move of getting onto his side of the board, so that makes me super excited. I leave my shooting range to basically try and kill the stuff that's in the forest. I know I got cover, but whatever. I move the Iron Guard up far enough where they can throw their dog at the chariots, and I like the idea of getting those rerollable to wounds on shambling targets, because that should really mess him up, I'm hoping. And over here, I decide to take a chance. I do kind of reform a little bit, do some moving around to support this flank, since this is where most of the fighting seems to be going. My berserkers on the left decide to go and repay the swarm for their kindness last turn, And then pretty much everything else that can throws itself into the front of this horde. Now, the downside about this is that if this does not work and I do not rout them and get a chance to reform, I've basically surrendered the air elementals to a flank charge from his snake worshippers or his snake riders. But I'm thinking 25 attacks from the berserkers, plus a good amount of attacks from the driller, plus 18 from the elementals, and I'm thinking of using the king to give the berserkers Bane Chant. I think I can do it. I hope I can do it. And I benefit from the fact that he is out of range of inspiring. So all I've got to do is get close enough and be able to make that die roll once. So it's a gamble, but I feel like it's a calculated gamble. Cannon goes off and throws 5 more wounds on the Snake Riders. I do also get the Bane Chant off on the Berserkers, but I did not take a picture of that. Over here, I shoot with both of my guns at the Scorpion and end up putting 7 wounds on it. Neither this or the other unit routes. And then, holy shit, does that Throwing Mastiff go to work. I hurl the Throwing Mastiff at the chariots, and that shit just keeps wounding and blowing up. I end up putting 6 wounds with the dog on the chariots, and I could not be happier. But I could be happier because that routes them. So my single little Throwing Mastiff takes out 3 Revenant chariots, and all that's left is a pile of bones and a puddle of dog piss, and I am thrilled. Over here in combat, as I pretty much assumed, the Berserkers deal with the swarms without problem. I reform like this because I figure that Bone Giant is going to come dance, and I want to be facing the front of that. And then over here, things go amazingly well. You can see over on the side there, I ended up doing 17 wounds to the Horde, plus the 1 brutal from the Battle Driller, and the nerve on the Horde of... where are they? The Horde of Revenants is 24. So, I mean, you're looking at 18. I only needed a 6, and I think you can see the dice down at the bottom. I rolled a 10. And they went bye-bye. So now I end up reforming. I've got it set up so that the other chariot horde, my battle driller, is actually just a little bit ahead of the berserkers. So basically his option when he comes in is going to be to either go at the battle driller and be able to hit that, or go at the berserkers. But if he does, the way he lines up is going to put him into the forest, which is going to make him hindered. So either way of that, I'm very, very happy. So sorry for the blurry picture, but we go into Dwarf turn 4. He decides to take the charge at the battle driller, as I pretty much assumed he would. He also decides to go ahead and finally get those snake guys into the front of the air elementals. Everything else here starts crowding up. In the center here, as predicted, the Bone Giant goes into the berserkers, and I'm thinking to myself, hey, this is good. He's going to be hindered, and I'll survive. And then I remember he's got Strider, so I'm actually kind of worried. I think that the Giant should be able to do, with decent rolls, should be able to do enough to take out the Berserkers. So that could be problematic. The Enslaved Guardians push up on this side as well, and his characters finally start coming forward a little bit. He moves up his Scorpion here. I'm guessing just to try and get up and prevent me from getting into too much of his stuff. But at this point, the way he moved it, if I charge, I'm not going to be hindered. So there's really no reason for me not to throw in there. So I'm thinking this may have been just kind of another bad move for him. Then he goes ahead and surges. I think he has to surge with both of his characters, but he gets the Enslaved Guardians up on me, which does actually put them just past the midpoint line, and stopping my Iron Guard cold. I'm still thinking he's not likely to break them, but it is going to kind of choke things up here. So over here, my opponent's dice just decide to bend him over the table. He ends up only doing 3 wounds to my air elementals and then rolls garbage to try and rout them. I think his total might have been 6. So they back off, and now the air elementals, I can't fly, so I can't jump over and go after those mummies like I was thinking about, but I'm going to go straight back into the worms, and they should be all right. Over here in good news, he does take the chariot into the driller and just absolutely massacres the driller, so it's kind of opened things up for him to keep going. And over here, yeah, the bone giant Rex face, not being hindered, really took the last hope my poor berserkers had. He had him up to 14 wounds and broke the living hell out of him. And then decides to back up as his movement. I think what he wants to do is, if I'm going to come at him next turn with the unit you can just barely see here at the bottom, he wants me to be hindered and kind of stuck in the middle of that forest, because otherwise he can still charge back at me, and since he's Strider, he's not going to be hindered. So I think that was actually a pretty good choice there. Over here, the Enslaved Guardians choke through another 4 wounds, but with the Inspiring and the Banner of the Griffin here, these Iron Guard just aren't going anywhere. So I decide on my turn 4 to go ahead and hurl the Berserkers at the chariots. I'm keeping the king up with them to throw Banechant. I do decide to go ahead and might as well try and squeeze a wound through, even though I'm hindered on the giant. And I throw the elementals back at the snakes. They don't have any crushing strength, because to make them air elementals, you have to switch out their crushing strength for their fly speed. So I'm not really sure how badly, if at all, I can hurt the snakes. So I go ahead and bring up this unit of Iron Guard with the great weapons behind it. So if next turn he finishes off my air elementals, I should be able to countercharge and wipe the snakes up pretty much immediately after that. I decide to go ahead and keep this fight going and send my shield Iron Guard back into his guardians. And again, a really blurry picture, but you can see I send the shield breakers into the scorpion husk. Cannon opens up on the mummies and throws 5 wounds on them. My war machines open up like crazy. This might be the war machines and the riflers. They open up in between all 3 of them with the penalties. They end up throwing 7 wounds on his high priest, but the high priest didn't go in anywhere. But then during combat, I absolutely demolish the scorpion husk and overrun deep into the forest. My problem here is I didn't want to overrun all 6, but I did, and so I run right into the forest. So now I've got the same problem that I had with the water. He's going to easily run past me because he's an individual and I'm not going to catch him. And so now it's going to take me a couple of turns to kind of push through the forest and get after those archers if that's the way I want to go with it. Over here, I don't do very well. I only put 3 wounds on the Enslaved Guardians, and they're not going anywhere, so it looks like we're going to keep pillow fighting for a while. Over here, I do the same amount onto the giant, so 3 wounds, again, not enough to really have any impact, but we bounce off. And over here, the air elementals dominate. They do a bunch of wounds, and I break the snake riders. On the left there against the chariots, you see the berserkers with their Banechant, because I did get it off. End up putting 7 wounds on the chariot, but it's not enough to affect them, so I bounce off an inch. So my opponent's turn 5, I guess this is, he decides to go ahead and push the chariots back at the berserkers, brings the mummies on because they weren't within range of charging my air elementals. Over here, he starts pushing his characters away. Obviously, he's trying to get out of my line of sight and get his characters where they can have an impact. Again, I think ultimately a lot of this comes down to my opponent just had a really bad deployment and kind of followed it up from that point. I have to say, in all fairness, he's kind of discouraged at this point, so I don't know kind of how much his head is in the game, but he's pushing on this way. He's also threw the enslaved guardians back into my Iron Guard. So he then does a surge. Yeah, he surges the archers up and over the fence, so he'll be able to sneak them, hopefully sneak them through and get them onto my side of the board and get some points. Yeah, the chariots do just a crazy amount of wounds. I'm up to, what is that, 15 wounds? But then his dice luck being garbage shows up and he rolls next to nothing, which is not going to break the berserkers, and his chariots have to bounce off. Over here, he only, again, his dice rolls are garbage. He only puts 3 wounds on the ironclad, and that's not going to be enough, so he bounces off. Over here, to make matters worse, so after 2 just garbage turns of combat, he gets into the enslaved guardians and only inflicts a single wound, even with 6 wounds on him. With inspiring there, he's not going to hurt me, so he bounces off again. At this point, my opponent's dice just want him to lose this game, and they're doing everything they can to assure that that happens. So we go into my turn 5, and I push the shield breakers forward. I figure I go ahead and kill these archers and make sure that I'm way deep in his backfield. I decide at this point that the Iron Guard are probably just going to stay here playing patty cake with the enslaved guardians forever. So rather than shooting, I go ahead and march up the riflemen to make sure that on turn 6 they'll be able to march through and get onto his side of the board. Over here, I decide that the chariots need to die. So I throw the berserkers and my great weapon Iron Guard into them. My plan still is to throw Bane Chant on the berserkers because that's just a lot of attacks. And I throw the ironclad back at his giant, figuring I don't know that I'll be able to do damage enough to kill it, but at least I'm not hindered this time and should be able to push through. And then over here, I decide to send my Air Force at his mummies. They've already got 5 wounds on them. I'm throwing 18 attacks. Maybe I'll get enough to rout them, but I definitely need them to stop getting all the way, because he actually needs to be able to like have me not be here and reform facing completely to the south. If he does that, he will be just barely with his entire unit on my side of the board and get a point for this, so I kind of want to stop that from happening. And then I don't do very well. The air elementals only put 2 wounds on the mummies, which is not enough to make that happen, and I bounce off. However, I make up for it by the complete and total demolition of the chariot unit, and the overrun from my berserkers puts them on his half of the board. Like, the back 2 models of my Iron Guard are still on my side of the board, so they're not counting yet. And the berserkers are still at a point where they could be taken out, so I'm not feeling overly comfortable there. I put 2 more wounds on the giant. He bounces off, no big deal. I put, looks like 1 more wound on the enslaved guardians. They bounce off, nothing happened in there. So during my opponent's turn 6, he decides to go ahead and give up these archers to turn them slightly so that they can see the berserkers that are injured on the other side of the board and hopefully take them out. Over here, he sends the mummies back at the Air Force. He decides to not move his archers. I guess he's just going to shoot forward. And then I didn't realize that that bounce back actually gave him enough room with this giant to thread the hole that had been made by my advancing units. So he moves his Pharaoh in front of my Berserkers, which puts him in line with being able to throw Surge. So he also moved his High Priest that's on the just to the edge of the forest so that he could see, and is within 12. So he essentially has 2 Surges on this giant to send him right in the back of the Air Force. And so that was a very clever look at things for my opponent that I just absolutely missed on last turn. So good on him. And during his shooting phase, that's exactly what happens. Double Surge sends the Bone Giant into the Air Elementals, and they are in rough shape. He does some shooting, looks like. Okay. Yeah, he shoots with this archer unit into the Iron Guard, but only puts 1 wound because 5-up armor is hard to get through. He also does 1 wound from the other archers onto my Berserkers. He ends up needing, I think, a 6 to throw, and I am just barely outside of inspiring. So he needs to throw a single 6 to make them go away, and rolls 3. Over here, his Enslaved Guardians finally get some action. They put a couple more wounds, but he rolls high enough on his nerve check to waver my Iron Guard over here, so that's good for him. Over here, this fight goes very badly for the Air Force, ends up killing them, and that reform that he needed to make actually makes it so that both the monster and the mummies are on my side of the table, so he's getting points for this. So my turn 6, I decide to go ahead and throw my Iron Guard into his archers. That shouldn't be too difficult. I throw my Berserkers at his character, figuring that he should at least pay for the sneakiness of stealth bombing me with a giant. I'm not sure how that works, but I figure I should at least put some hurting on him for that. These guys in the middle end up pushing up, so they're on his side, as do my riflemen. I can't do anything with the Iron Guard, so they're just going to stay there. And my shield breakers at the side do get into a flank charge with his archers in the back. Over here... Oh, okay, yeah, I see what... So because I didn't charge back in, I did have a line of sight with, I think it was the far organ gun, and the organ gun blows the regiment of Enslaved Guardians off the table, which is good because they were on my side of the table, so that would have given him some points, so I denied him some there. Over here, my Iron Guard do 6 wounds to his archers, which is not enough to take them out. I bounce back, but I still am just barely on his side of the board, so I'm going to get credit for that. Same thing over here with the Berserkers. I throw 5 wounds onto his Pharaoh, and that's fine. I bounce back, but I'm still on his side. So at this point, it's just roll to see if we go into turn 7. Oh, no, wait a minute. I'm sorry. It is not quite rolled to see if we go into turn 7 yet. I end up doing 6 wounds to his archers. It is not enough to rout them, and I bounce off. Now we roll to see if we go into turn 7.
This is completely unacceptable,
Pharaoh Jafar thought, shambling back and forth in his war room.
I have the numbers, I have the forces, and yet we were utterly destroyed. With the ability of my army and the lack of will they demonstrated, I must rethink my entire strategy. I sense that they have not yet given up on my cause, yet I see my army in utter shambles.
After continuing to dwell on the subject for a few moments, the pharaoh surmised.
Perhaps all hope is not lost. Perhaps we need a change of scenery.
A sly smirk came across his face. Well, as much of one that can come across the face of the living undead. And he mentally commanded to his troops.
Ready yourselves. We move out.
So yeah, this one turned into a pretty big blowout for the dwarves. There was no turn 7. So as things stand, I end up having, 5 regiments on his side of the board for 10 total points. All he has is a troop and a monster. So that is 2 points for the Empire of Dusk, 10 for the dwarves. So very solid. The Empire is blocked from trespassing into the mountain passes and will have to find another way south. So this was arguably the most one-sided game that we've had so far. And I think the main reason had to do with my opponent's inexperience. His deployment was, well, not to put too fine a point on it, but his deployment was god-awful. He was choking himself up pretty much the whole game. He was overly afraid of the forest, and I'm not entirely sure why, because not being able to move at the advance really doesn't do anything to most of his army. I think he was thinking, once I had put most of mine in front of the forest on my side, that he was going to sweep around from the right, but then he didn't put his characters in a place where he could use his surge and really take advantage of that. I think if he had redeployed those guys more towards the right, he really could have surge charged me with a lot of stuff and could have possibly broken that right flank. But really, I think that the setup he had just made it very, very difficult for him to overcome that. And I think he's still thinking about his army, I think, as individual pieces and how each individual piece does, as opposed to understanding how they all have to work together. And I think that was really a bad thing for him. On my side, I think I did great. I love being able to use my gyrocopters as air elementals. Those guys are a great long-range threat that, other than shooting, the dwarves don't really have. As far as the Warsmith, his elite really only mattered one turn, and for the points he has, it's almost more worth it to get another War Machine, I think. And I may try that the next time I play the dwarves, but yeah, he just was not worth his points. Other than that, I really like having both the king and the standard bearer. It spreads a lot of inspiring around, and the banner of the griffin is amazing. Makes up for me being able to use some of the lower point cost units other than just the Iron Guard like my dwarf opponent usually does. So I got a chance to kind of mix things up. The Berserkers are amazing. I love Berserkers. I loved Slayers when we played Warhammer and 9th Age, and I love the Berserkers in this game. I need to get me some of the ones that ride the Badgers, because that's freaking awesome. But I think definitely having a lot of attacks just concentrated there really helped me punch through his right side, and they were just absolutely great. My cannon was lighting up. I think I took 5 shots with the cannon and it hit 4 out of the 5 times. So I need to kind of think in my mind that that's not going to happen every game. But when it does, holy crap, that was effective. But all in all, this was a good first outing for the dwarves for me. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you have any questions, comments, or rules complaints if we got some stuff wrong, certainly go ahead and throw them in the comments below. I try and answer every comment that gets placed. Other than that, hopefully you guys are enjoying the different parts of the narrative campaign, and we are going to be continuing this. I'm hoping to have one, if not two games this coming week. So if we can do that, we'll have even more battle reports up for you shortly. So hope you guys enjoy, and thanks for watching.